Good morning. I'm Curtis Hubbard, a consultant with Voces Unidas, and I will be emceeing today's presentation. Let's give a couple of minutes for additional attendees to join us, and we'll get started here 10:01, 10:02. All right. We have a pretty good group on here this morning. So again, I'm Curtis Hubbard. We're pleased that you're joining us for the preview of the 5th Annual Colorado Latino Policy Agenda. Our webinar today includes a presentation of key findings, and we've also set aside time at the end for questions using the Q&A feature here in the Zoom webinar. We can take them. You can also you can type them in, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you at the end. This webinar is also being recorded, and we can make copies available for you upon request afterwards. We're doing things a little bit differently this year, making our data available earlier to the media and other interested parties in this preview, and then that will be followed by publication of our full report planned for September 23rd. In addition to today's webinar, the press release and polling top lines are now public. You can find all that information online at the website Colorado Latino Policy Agenda.org. Again, that's Colorado Latino Policy Agenda.org. And with that housekeeping out of the way, I'll turn it over to Alex Sanchez of Voces Unidas.
Thanks, Curtis, and good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Sanchez. I'm the president and CEO of Voces Unidas. We are a nonprofit organization based in Glenwood Springs. Thank you for joining us this morning for this media preview of the 2025 Colorado Latino Policy Agenda, an annual nonpartisan report designed to provide insights into the demographic makeup and the views of Latinas and Latinos in Colorado on pressing policy, political, and social issues. This report is part of a broader initiative, the Colorado Latino Agenda. It's a statewide, nonpartisan public research initiative co-led by Voces Unidas and Color that publishes relevant and timely in-depth reports about Latinas and Latinos in Colorado. This will be actually our 5th year publishing the report, and we're excited to share some of the highlights and our takeaways from this annual poll that we use to inform it. Obviously, we do this with researchers and political scientists, experts in the field. Joining us this morning is Dr. Gabe Sanchez, whose team at BSP Research conducted the poll and provided the analysis now for the 5th straight year. Dr. Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Alex, to both you, Dusty, and all of your teams for, again, getting us to this point of being able to share some wonderful and robust data with everybody today. As noted, this is the 5th year of our efforts together, and my job will be to walk you through a relatively short slide deck that hits on the high points or the major themes for this year's policy agenda survey. I'll note you have all these materials, so you know this is literally just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the major themes. Please dive into the data to see all the nuances across jurisdiction, congressional district, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. If you could scroll to the polling design slide, it's perfect. I'll just hit on some of these high points. Obviously, if you have additional questions about the methodology, I'd be loved to tackle those questions at the back end of the presentation. Every year, Alex and Dusty essentially challenge us at BSP Research to push things even further than the last year. And in this context, you see robust sample size of 1,700 randomly drawn and representative sample of Latinos across the state of Colorado. That is by far the greatest sample size of any poll conducted of Latinos in Colorado over the last 5 years that focuses specifically on politics and policy attitudes. You see very recent data. We closed fielding on August 6th of this year. And as always, we use a very blended approach, essentially the widest net possible to capture respondents across the state of Colorado, including web-based interviews and telephone interviews. And our telephone interviews are conducted on both landlines and cell phones. And across all data collection efforts, we always make sure that it's fully bilingual, with respondents able to participate in either language of their choice or go back and forth bilingually in English and Spanish. And you see at the end of the day, we had 447 respondents this year that conducted their survey in Spanish. At the end of the day, we weight the data to the best known estimates of the US CPS survey to make sure that the demographics match the parameters of the Latino population across the state. That's how we essentially determine that we can ensure that this is representative of the population. As always, across all 5 years, one of the major goals of our survey is to make sure that all voices are included in our survey, including those from harder to reach areas of the state, the rural regions. So you see that we have a large oversample of the rural segments of the state that I'll show you in a second, as well as congressional districts that have major influence across the state. CD3 and CD8, you see robust samples. One other thing that I'll draw your attention to, this is the first year across the 5 years of polling that Alex and Dusty asked us to make sure that we also included a subsample of non-registered voters. Again, the aim every year, let's be more inclusive and try to have as truly representative a sample as possible of all Latinos across the state of Colorado. On the next slide, you'll see visually, right, just how robust this sample is and how many segments of the overall Latino population we're able to capture in our sampling approach. Most surveys of Latinos or anybody else in the context of voters or registered voters in Colorado typically focus on the metropolitan areas of the state because it's easier to do that. Our survey, as you see, tries to ensure that all quadrants of the state have large enough samples to be able to break results out by Denver metro area, Northeast, Southeast, and West. You see well over 300 respondents across each one of those regional pockets. And again, we know that folks are interested in what's going on across the congressional districts in the state. This year, similar to last year, we ensured that every single congressional district had at least 100 respondents to be able to look specifically at top lines for those districts. But you see in the areas of significant importance, CD1, CD3, and CD8, much more robust samples. And those are the areas that I'll speak to a little bit across today's presentation. Obviously, you'll have the opportunity to look at more detailed data for those jurisdictions on your own. So we always start every year of polling, really trying to identify what are the most important policy priorities for the Latino community. Again, given that this survey is generally aimed at trying to ensure that policymakers know what the values and priorities are of the Latino population in the state, we always want to make sure we identify across both federal and state level policy jurisdiction what are the core top priorities. Just as we've seen over the last several years of polling, economic concerns are the top priority for Latino voters. In fact, you see all three of the top issues, when isolated individually, are tied to the economy and personal finances. And I think, again, reflects the strain that a lot of Latinos, unfortunately, in our communities are continuing to feel economically. You see addressing the rising cost of living and inflation is top up there at 33%, right alongside improving wages and income. This marks the 4th year in a row where addressing the rising cost of living and inflation is the #1 issue at the federal level. So again, just screams that Latinos unfortunately need more policy reform, more resources to address really challenging economic time periods for this population. Another thing that I want to draw your attention to is you see 20% of all Latino respondents identified protecting immigrants' rights and immigration reform. That's 1 in 5 Latinos identifying immigration reform and protecting immigrants in this very, very challenging climate for immigrants across the country and in Colorado. When you couple that with the segment of the population who identified border enforcement as a priority, you put those together, immigration jumps up into the top 3 just above lowering healthcare costs, right? So it gives us some indication of the importance that immigration it means to segments of the Latino population across the state of Colorado. Again, we also look at the same question, but want to isolate state level priorities. So exact same frame, except here we're asking folks specifically the governor and the state legislature. What are the issues that you want them to address? A lot of commonality across both state and federal, especially as it pertains to economic concerns, which you see again are the top of minds of Latinos across the state of Colorado. And in fact, all four of the top issues Latinos want the state to address, again, are tied to personal household finances or to the economy more generally. I'll also identify that reproductive health and protecting access to abortion, right? You see in both federal and state priorities crack the top 10, down a little bit from the high that we saw, I believe, in 2022 in the context of Dobbs, but that remains a high priority for a large segment of the Latino population across the state. And we also see in the context of looking at state priorities, creating affordable and attainable housing and homelessness emerge as other key priorities for the Latino population. We try to do a very good comprehensive job of trying to explain why some of the top priorities emerge for the Latino population across Colorado. And obviously with economic concerns for 4 years in a row, right, being the top dominant at the minds of Latino voters when they're thinking about politics and policy, one of the common issues we've asked across all 5 surveys is this one, asking folks about their personal financial situation. Have things gotten better, gotten worse, or stayed roughly the same? Almost identical to what we've seen over the past 3 years. 1/3 of Latinos' financial situation has gotten worse over the last year, and essentially the same segment of the population, a third, indicates things have gotten better, with the rest of the folks, the other third, essentially indicating that things have stayed about the same. When we look at the data over time, one of the things that I want to make sure is crystal clear is, unfortunately, every single year we ask this item, roughly a third of the Latino community has continued to lose ground financially and indicated things have gotten worse. When you look at the crosstabs, not surprising, it's folks that make under $40,000 a year, have less than a college education, that tend to be the folks that are unfortunately every year falling further and further behind and not being able to keep up with inflation. I think that sends a strong message that Latinos overall, right, want to see more done to address these financial concerns, and that unfortunately the gap between those of us in the community that are doing well and those that are falling behind is unfortunately growing among the Latino population in the state. We also track just general trends of how the Latino population in the state feels a number of different entities are moving, right? Is the US as a whole, the state of Colorado, or the county moving in the right or wrong direction? You see a couple of things, again, consistent over the last couple of years. Folks are more likely to perceive that their state at 54% or their county at 53% are going in the right direction relative to the country as a whole at only 38%. So Latinos across the state recognize that, you know, you've got a little pocket of heaven in Colorado where, although things aren't moving in the right direction, at least in their perception overall in the country, much brighter and rosy opinions as it pertains to their state and their local county. One of the new items that we asked this year, and I know this was something that folks that might have participated in last year's press release asked us for, and we tried to be responsive, is an item that followed up on direction of how things are moving with, who do you feel is most responsible? So in this question, if you were asked, you know, I think that the country is moving in the right direction, you were followed up with, who do you think is most responsible for that? And the same dynamic, if you think things are moving in the wrong direction, who do you think is most responsible? Take-home message is obviously that President Trump is a very polarizing political entity. You see, in fact, for folks who think that the country is moving in the right direction, most dominant perceived reason is President Trump at 50%. And for those who think the country is moving in the wrong direction, even more identification as President Trump for the reason for that at 66%. So at the end of the day, although you do see some interesting trends across policies approved by Biden or supported by Democrats in Congress, you see that the take-home message is President Trump is the dominant force for how people are perceiving that the country is moving. One of the things that I, however, want to draw your attention to is among Latinos who perceive the country is moving in the wrong direction, you see more than 3 times as likely to indicate that actions by corporations and billionaires is driving that direction, right, and moving things into an area that they don't want to see happen at the federal or overall US level. With a shift transition towards an increase in border enforcement and specifically mass deportation and deportation policy, this year's survey has a large segment of content specifically looking at immigration attitudes and how Latinos in Colorado are reacting to some of the shifts we've seen in federal immigration policy. In this context, we asked folks, essentially at the end of the day, one of the overall backdrops of what's happening in immigration policy is the federal government and the Trump administration asking state and local officials essentially to collaborate to enforce some of their deportation policies. So we asked directly, would you oppose or support an elected official here in Colorado who took the following actions, right? Volunteers to give the Trump administration and ICE state Medicaid data about undocumented immigrants, and again, making sure that we note this is against state law in the state of Colorado. You see, 66% of Latinos in Colorado reject that notion, would not support an elected official who took that collaborative approach. Similarly, 61% of Latinos in Colorado reject volunteering to share identifiable data about the whereabouts specifically of immigrant children in Colorado. Again, sharing that information with the Trump administration and ICE, only 39% support. So you see, at the end of the day, Latinos overall oppose local officials collaborating with ICE and the Trump administration, specifically as it pertains to Medicaid data and obviously our most vulnerable segment of the population, children. We also wanted to track, right, the growing propensity of, individuals from ICE not wearing body camera, not sharing their identity, etc. So we posed this question and asked folks if they agreed or disagreed with the statement. All law enforcement officers operating in the state of Colorado should identify themselves, wear body cameras, drive clearly marked vehicles, and essentially treat everybody in the community with dignity and respect. You see, almost all Latinos in the sample, at 84%, agree with this statement. Commonsensical, rational approach to utilization of ICE for border enforcement. They want folks to be treated with respect, and they think it's just obvious that it should be a transparent process. Similarly, when we asked, should ICE agents be allowed to stop anyone they suspect of being undocumented, even if that means some Latino citizens may also be targeted for questioning, you see the exact opposite. Only 38% agree with that statement. And obviously, a lot of Latinos in Colorado recognize, even if they're far removed from the immigrant experience themselves, we don't want a policy environment where it's fair game to essentially look for folks who they might perceive look like immigrants and detain or deport those individuals. So again, very commonsensical, rational approaches to dealing with ICE, specifically in the context of federal government immigration policies. This year, one of the major themes that we wanted to tackle was healthcare, and specifically thinking about health insurance. Again, some of this is a reaction to some of the changing environment at the federal level in terms of federal funding. So we asked individuals every year in the context of the policy poll, essentially, are you insured and what type of insurance do you have? And you see that overall across the full state of Colorado, 9% of Latinos in the state report that they do not currently have health insurance. That's up slightly from 7% in last year's poll. So unfortunately indicates that a growing segment of Latinos are uninsured. One thing I want to draw your attention to is when we look at the crosstabs at internal variation, one segment of the population who is much more likely to be uninsured are the non-voting segment at 15%. Right? So I think 3 times as likely as voters to lack health insurance. Speaks to the importance of including that subsample in this year's survey so that we can look at potential differences between that segment of the population and others. And I will say, looking at all the healthcare measures that we had in this year's survey, non-voters are most likely to also be unsatisfied with the healthcare that they receive across the state of Colorado. We also see that individuals making less than $40,000 annually in terms of their annual income are also at 15% more likely to be uninsured. Finally, and it will segue to the next slide, we see that a large segment, essentially a third of Latinos in Colorado who are covered by health insurance are covered by Medicaid. And I think that's a perfect segue to this question that we asked in the survey, with a large segment of Latinos in Colorado covered by Medicaid, obviously a growing concern by all states, especially those that have a large segment of their population covered in health insurance through Medicaid, is what might happen if the projected decrease in federal funding for Medicaid starts to hit the states. And unfortunately, all healthcare experts, including myself, indicate a large segment of Latinos in Colorado, as well as in other states across the country, will unfortunately be in jeopardy of losing access to health insurance. So you see, when we asked directly all respondents, what would happen if someone in your household, including yourself, were to lose their health insurance coverage, including Medicaid? You see pretty dire consequences that are projected for Latinos in the state of Colorado. 40% indicate that they wouldn't be able to afford out-of-pocket life-saving medication. Think about the dire extremity of not having access to medication that you know is projected to save your life, skipping or delaying wellness or regular checkups or vaccinations, going into medical debt, etc. All of these dire consequences, I want to stress, are not just strains to the individual families, that we see projected in the data, but will put significant strains to the healthcare system across the state of Colorado. All healthcare experts like myself, just by way of context, I have an endowed chair funded by Robert Wood Johnson to focus specifically on healthcare. And one of the things that we know is being able to participate in what a lot of us refer to as essentially, healthcare at the front end, going to get vaccinated, having, social welfare checks to make sure all your health is in order is much cheaper for states than unfortunately seeing people delay or postpone those things because they don't have access to health insurance. And then they end up in the emergency room with a large bill that the state has to cover. So we should all be concerned with this projected dynamic because it won't, again, only be problematic for individual families, but it will put strains on the entire system. One of the other things that we've consistently tracked is the rates at which Latinos in the state of Colorado personally or indirectly are impacted by discrimination due to race or ethnicity. In this year's survey, we specifically asked whether or not they feel Latinos overall as a community are treated fairly or unfairly across a number of different entities. You see that the green number at the bar chart is indicating the percentage who think Latinos are treated fairly. There's some positive semblances in there. 64% perceive that the public education system treats Latinos fairly, 63% the healthcare system treats Latinos fairly. But again, keep in mind that means that roughly a third of Latinos don't believe either one of those really important systems in the state treats all Latinos fairly and equally. Much less rosy reality in the context of how Latinos perceive the criminal justice system, the media, and specifically the child welfare system treats Latinos in the state. So it gives a pretty strong indication that these particular entities have a lot of room for improvement in terms of how Latinos perceive they're treating their community. We also had a wide range of approval and favorability ratings in this year's policy poll, essentially tracking a number of different entities. We do this every year, but we've made this even more expansive in this particular survey year by looking specifically at differences based on the party of members in Congress. So you see that when we ask folks about the president, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, Democrats among Latinos are perceived more favorably in Congress with higher favorability ratings, especially as it pertains to comparisons to Republicans. And we think of that 41% approval rating for President Trump, flip side of that, 55% disapproval rating, well below the 50% marker that all political scientists like myself look at as an indication of whether or not an elected official like the president is performing positively with the community. When we look at disapproval rates for President Trump, it's the highest at CD5, CD4, CD2, and particularly CD3. You look at that, 58% of Latinos in CD3 don't have favorable opinions of how President Trump is performing right now in his duties as president. Finally, we asked the favorability question of a number of different important elected officials across the state of Colorado. You see approval is generally highest for U.S. Senator on both sides. Bennett Hickenlooper, both have very strong approval ratings among Latinos in the state of Colorado, significantly lower for the Attorney General and Secretary of State. I also want to point your attention to CD8. Obviously, a lot of attention will be paid for this rematch when we come to the congressional election races. I'll tell you, across all congressional district races in the country, Colorado CD8 is going to be one of the most watched and probably one of the most tightest in terms of projected outcomes. So you see in that particular congressional district, respondents have higher favorability ratings towards former member of Congress Caraveo at 53% relative to Gabe Evans. So a significant advantage for Caraveo, at least in favorability ratings. We know from our prior years that she was highly popular among Latinos in her district. So again, a little bit of foreshadowing to what we know will be an important race to watch down the line. So again, with that, I'll turn it over to folks for questions about any of the data. Again, just the tip of the iceberg, hitting on the major themes, a lot more data for folks to unpack as you start to glean through all of the different data books that we provided as part of our journey this year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabe. And we will now take any questions that you have. Please use the Q&A feature or raise your hand, and we will try to get to you as we can. Don't see any questions at the moment. Here's one from John Frank of Axios Denver. He wanted to know what are the margins of error for the data in CD8 and CD3.
Great question. I'll see if my team, who's probably going to be quicker to pulling that, can find those specific numbers. You saw the overall margin of error, 2.4% for the overall poll. At roughly N of 300, my guess would be, my team backed me up on this, probably margin of errors closer to 6% would be what I would project for thinking about those specific congressional districts. Not quite as low as 2%, but still pretty strong. Doesn't give you too much caution in looking at any of those items that we broke out in today's presentation.
Good. Next, we have a question from Caitlin Kim of Colorado Public Radio. Caitlin, I'm going to unmute you, so go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, thanks for doing this. I just had a quick question about the CD8 Caraveo versus Evans. Why just focus on Caraveo and not any of the other? Why not pull on any of the other Democratic candidates running for the nomination? Thanks.
Great. I'll take that question. Great. So we polled on statewide federal elected officials, so current office holders. And then because we had a Latina in that same seat and we have a Latino in that same seat, we went ahead and polled on the former member of Congress in that seat. This was meant to be sort of nonpartisan and not necessarily looking at sort of all the candidates that may or may not still sort of jump in any race. We are still going to be doing more polling in the future. And also we're going to be looking at this next year as well, next summer. So this was not as a question, was not meant to test the current candidates in the races for any of these races, whether it's governor, whether it's attorney general, or any of the federal congressional races.
We have a question from John Frank. John, you're unmuted, so go right ahead.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for taking my question. Looking again at those CD8 numbers that Caitlin just mentioned, what's the effect at work here that has Evans down to Caraveo? In particular, how much is Trump pulling him down, if at all? I'm not sure if you're able to tell that from the numbers. Thank you.
Great question, Mr. Frank. I can follow up with you. I mean, I can look at Trump favorability to see if some of that, helps explain what that gap might look like. But we have tracked on this in the last poll that we did specific to the election content. So I can pull some of those numbers to give you an indication. This is pretty consistent with what we've seen in prior polls when we were looking more at the horse race and thinking about the election results. So I don't think this is new per se. I think it's in line with what we've seen in the past when we've had some numbers specific to that CD8 race.
Next, we have a question from Kyle McKinnon of KUNC, who asks, how do some of the survey's most notable trends or changes compare to when we first started 5 years ago?
Yeah, great question to start, and then let other. I mean, the thing that I think sticks out as being the most consistent over this time period is just the salience of the economy. The fact that you see the top priority over 4 years in a row, almost at the exact same percentage, inflation, cost of living, I think screams loudly. And this is in line with what we've seen nationally, but the nuance to Colorado is that polls even higher among Latinos in Colorado. And specifically, we see affordability of housing jump up as a higher priority. And that's been consistent across all 5 years of polling. It gives us some indication that I know the state has done a lot to try to address rising inflation and specifically housing costs. But unfortunately, a large segment of the Latino population still sees that as an area of needed improvement. I think that's the one thing that jumps out as kind of the consistent trend that we've seen over all 5 years of polling on that issue.
And if I could just tease for the members of the press here is that we will be doing a longitudinal analysis of 5 years worth of data. Just to remind all of us, we do the summer poll, which is this one, meant to be more policy focused. It's the larger of the polls, but we've also do exit polling. And so we now have about, in 5 years, at least 7 or 8 polls that we have done as part of the Colorado Latino Agenda initiative. And so this year, in late November, early December, we intend to release analysis of 5 years worth of data through BSP research. So more to come on that on that opportunity later on.
And one quick update for the first question on margin of error for those CDs. My colleague Jordan ran the math. I think I said 6% for CD8 is 5.7%. So I was pretty close, but wanted to give you the exact number.
Good. And we have a follow-up from Lucas Woods to the previous question, and he asks how Trump's approval rating among Latino voters compares this year to last year.
Good question. Grab another one, Curtis. I'm going to see if I can pull that number from last year's report real quick.
Good. And this one is, I think, Alex and Dusty will be good at taking a first swing at. John Daly with Colorado Public Radio asks if we can summarize the impact of Medicaid cuts. And I can go back to that slide if that's helpful.
I can start with that one. So I'm Dusty. Hi, everyone. I'm the president and CEO for Color. And we've, of course, been monitoring health insurance coverage and particularly Medicaid over the last 5 years because of the work that we do to ensure that our community has health insurance and gets the care that they need. So I think it's interesting given that about 250,000 Coloradans will be potentially cut from the congressional actions earlier this month. And I think given that tomorrow is our start of our special session here in Colorado, there's still some potential harmful impacts that we're monitoring, not just on Medicaid, but also other safety net programs that we've created here in Colorado, like OmniSalud. And so it's, I mean, I don't think we know the full breadth of the impact. I mean, if you look at this slide, we sort of dug in a little bit on what are the specific things impacting. And we know, that folks who don't have health insurance, those impacts are going to be far reaching with regard to how they live their life, right? Their time off from work, they're being able to pay rent if they can't get their medication. So I think it's going to be, they're very harmful. They're very detrimental. We're really worried, and we're going to monitor what comes out of the special session. And we know, and I know Alex will speak to this too, that the impacts in the urban areas, of course, oftentimes are even worse for folks who live in rural Colorado, with the sort of gaps in care in providers already. And so, it's very worrisome, but which is why I think it's important and timely that we have this data to show lawmakers and to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they're taking into account the impacts, not just based on numbers, but these are actual people and families that are going to be impacted by these cuts.
And all
Alex are good.
And I'll just add is that on top of what Dusty has already mentioned, Latinas and Latinos are more likely to be uninsured, are more likely, obviously, to face other chronic sort of disease and have the least access to healthcare services with these potential cuts to services. It's not potential. There will be cuts. They're both coming from the feds, and then now the state has an opportunity to see how we're going to deal with this at the state level. But the impact to not just urban, but suburban and rural Latinas and Latinos will be potentially devastating. The data also suggests that, Latinas and Latinos, our health and well-being, and this is the first time that we're actually measuring this as a question for our longitudinal studies in the future, is I think almost 60% of Latinas and Latinos, our well-being, our self-identified health has either gotten worse or remained the same. And given the challenges both in access and insurance and some of the chronic illnesses that many Latinas and Latinos face in the state, that's obviously a baseline number that we're publishing this year for the very first time. And we'll continue to monitor in terms of how all these policy decisions at the federal level, state level, and local level are going to impact the health and well-being of Latinas and Latinos moving forward.
Only thing I'll add to that important question is keep in mind, right, healthcare costs are the third highest priority for Latinos at the federal level. So if we already know healthcare costs, right, is one of, and most research has suggested when folks say the cost of living, right, and inflation is the #1 issue for them. When you ask deeper, what does that mean? Healthcare costs is the driver of that as well. So we know that Latinos are unfortunately already saying healthcare is too expensive. And so if there's drops in access to health insurance coverage, that's just going to explode that already existing trend. And then one quick nitpick on the last question about Trump favorability. We asked that on the exit poll from last year, and pretty consistent with what we saw now, except for unfavorability jumped from 52% in the exit poll last year to 55%. So slight movement towards unfavorable, but pretty consistent with what we saw last year.
Thanks. And our next.
Can I just add, Curtis, something? I know Curtis has also added something in the chat from our national poll. Voces Unidas in Colorado, the Colorado Latino Agenda, also participates in national polling. We obviously oversample in Colorado to make sure that the national trends around the 100-day polls of any new administration or the 1-year mark, et cetera, that we have data on Colorado Latinas and Latinos as well. But what I'll say about both effectiveness and favorability, so those are two different questions. Historically, as the Colorado Latino Policy Agenda report, we have done effectiveness. So you can see and you can track data over time on how effective do Latinas and Latinos feel this office, i.e. the governor's office or any other office that we test. So you can see data tracking. This is the first time that we've done favorability. So now it's, do you approve or disapprove of X office holder? And so we're also setting a baseline. We are releasing that as a separate report, and you'll see that reflected in how we write it in the press release. It's still a nonpartisan poll. It's still a nonpartisan. It's not about sort of testing the candidates, but it is about giving better data to the ecosystem to make sure that people know how Latinas and Latinos feel about our current office holders and where they're at. It is what it is, and you can now start to see that breakdown. This will be probably a question that will be consistent moving forward so that we have obviously data that we can track over time as well.
In that information I just put in the chat for the call, and you can find the results of the 100 days poll online at the Colorado Latino Policy Agenda.org website. There should be a link there, there is a link there to the 100 days poll. We do have a follow-up from Andrea with the Glenwood Springs Post-Independent and Aspen Times, asking about how Trump's favorability compare over the 5 years that we've done the poll. And I think Alex just answered that this is the first time we've done that as part of the summer Colorado Latino Policy Agenda polling, but we did ask it as part of that 100 days poll that was released in February of this year.
And Andrea, I think you can also find over the last 5 years different, if you want to know how many Latinas and Latinos voted or self-reported that they voted for Trump versus any other sort of candidate, or how they voted in 16 and 20 and 22, 24. So that data is available. Effectiveness is the only probably metric that you're going to have for at least a couple years on, President Trump, for example. But favorability is a brand new marker that we're inserting this year. This will be baseline, and then in the future, you'll be able to track changes over time.
And we have one more question from Caitlin Kim of Colorado Public Radio. Go right ahead, Caitlin.
Hi, thanks again. Sorry. And I don't know if the polling really asked this question, but I'm curious if you can derive any information based on the poll to the question I have, which is obviously Republicans have been looking to the Latino population, shifting more towards their party when it comes to voting. And are you seeing anything in this polling that would back up sort of those theories that Republicans are making inroads with the Latino community? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that unless Alex or Dusty, you would like to start.
No, start and then we'll do the follow-ups. Yeah.
I mean, I will say, if you look at our data over time, the take-home message, the way that I see it in the data is there has been a slight movement towards Republican Party in terms of voting behavior, slightly more positive attitudes. but that shift in Colorado is much smaller than what we've seen nationally. So we always try to make the point that Colorado isn't Florida, isn't some of these places where you see a radical shift. It's been minor in almost in all cases, not outside of statistical margin of error for the poll. This year's poll, I see, I guess, mixed evidence, right? And I'll spend a little bit more time unpacking this and let Alex and Dusty follow up if they like. The one area where I see there might be a rebound back towards Democrats is the overall standing of the economy. You see that overwhelmingly that's the top priority among Latinos in the state of Colorado. When you look at the underlying data, it's pretty clear that they don't feel as though things are getting better as it pertains to the transition to the Trump administration. So given that that was the top priority we've seen in prior polls for folks who are indicating why they were supporting Trump and Republicans, if they don't see positive movement on inflation, cost of goods, that's going to be positive in terms of a potential rebound slightly for Democrats as it pertains to Latinos in Colorado. The area, however, if you want to see some prospects for opportunities for Republicans to make gains with Latinos in Colorado is on immigration. And you see it's doubled in terms of its salience when we think about border protection. And although overwhelmingly we see Latinos in Colorado prefer a balanced approach to immigration reform that includes treating immigrants with respect, making sure, as you saw, that ICE agents are acting transparently, etc., you do see evidence that Latinos are a little bit more open to border enforcement than they have been in the past. And my perception about that is, again, it's about the economy. I feel as though the Trump campaign's messaging and the presidential campaign that emphasized essentially immigrants as being the scapegoat for everything from cost of living, lack of affordable housing, anything pertaining to the economy not doing great. I think there was some evidence that Latinos were starting to buy into that reality a little bit and perceiving maybe that might be true. And again, this poll suggests that as they've actually seen border enforcement and particularly mass deportation efforts ramp up, I think there's going to be a little bit of a sobering effect among some of those Latinos who might have been open to Trump and Republicans' attitudes on immigration, their approaches, as they see that, unfortunately, a large segment we've seen of Latinos who are not immigrants themselves being impacted by the way deportation is being handled. So a little bit of a long-winded answer to a good question.
The thing that I'll add for Caitlin is we will release in the September sort of report. That's the community-friendly publication with a lot more data visualized. We do have and the data is there now. You can obviously take a look at it now in terms of how many people over the last couple of years, have become more conservative, all self-reported, or more liberal, or those swings. So we have been tracking that for now 5 years. This will be our 5th year. To what Dr. Sanchez said, I think in 2024 and before, I think the data was suggesting that we had just as many people, Latinos and Latinos, turning conservative versus turning liberal, but there was a slight sort of shift to at least voter habits, as Dr. Sanchez alluded to Republicans, but we were not seeing the big shifts that other states. The data in our exit poll in 2024 confirms that, right? We did not see Latino men, for example, like other states where they had a huge swing. The data in Colorado did not suggest it. The self-reported exit polling of Latino voters in Colorado in 2024 suggested that Latino men voted consistently with the rest of Colorado. Also in the 100-day poll, I think you're also starting to see even those Latinas and Latinos who voted for Donald Trump saying, I didn't vote for some of these things. I didn't think this is what exactly was going to happen. So you start to see some of that data. So I would invite you to take a look at our exit poll in 2024, our 100-day poll that we released in April, and obviously the new fresh data that we're still processing and evaluating. And then in September, you'll have another update from us with more visuals that sort of synthesize some of the data. And I think this is a question that I think will be very important to address in the longitudinal analysis that we do 5 years worth of data, because it's going to be your question, Caitlin, combined with also self-reported data from Latinas and Latinos in every corner of the state that say, am I engaged in the political system? Are Republicans reaching me or versus Democrats? Is the Republican Party or the Democratic Party reaching me more than or are candidates, reaching out to Latinos? And I think we've been tracking that data. So that's solid data points that we have been tracking over time. And we can address that also in the longitudinal study.
Thanks, Alex. I believe that is all of the questions. We do have a couple of more minutes. So if there's something pressing that you want to get into the discussion, we do have time to answer that question for you. And if not, I did just put a link to the website where this and previous polling is all housed. And feel free to reach out to me if you have follow-up questions, and we can put you in touch with Dr. Sanchez or Alex or Dusty to get answers to those questions. I think that is going to do it for our questions today. I want to thank everyone for your attendance, your interest. Please follow up if there are any questions. Thank you to our panelists. We'll give you one shot to say farewell or to add anything you think would be important for the discussion.
Just to thank, obviously, the members of the media for continuing to follow some of this data. We hope it's useful as we get feedback from all of you, or as you ask us questions about the items or issues that you're also looking data for. We also take that in consideration as we think about sort of future polls. So thanks to Dr. Sanchez, thanks to Curtis, thank you obviously to our partner with Color, Dusty Goulet, their CEO, for all the wonderful work. It's been a great partnership, 5 years. More data to come, more releases, more updates. In September, you'll have more, but please feel free, as Curtis said, to reach out if you want to chat with us before the September release.
Good.
Yeah, not much else to say. Thank you, all of you who participated in the webinar. And again, if you have any very specific questions that you can't find in the data points, make sure to get in touch with Curtis or any of the other members of the team, and they'll make sure that us data nerds have an opportunity to dig in and give responsive results to you to give you what you need for your stories.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.